So a couple of days ago, I ran into a former student of mine who is now an adult and married. I had him in a class my first couple of years of teaching. As we were talking and catching up, we were laughing about some of the crazy moments that happened in my class. And then he said this: yeah, back in those days, you really had no idea what you were doing. And let me just tell you something, that made my heart stop for a minute. Now, to be clear, I love this guy, and I don't think he would have said that if he didn't think that we could laugh about it, and we did. But I admit, something lurched inside of me when he said that. And to be fair, he was absolutely right. I had precisely no idea what I was doing. But that thing lurched inside me because I thought I was good enough at faking it that nobody would ever know. And apparently, I was wrong. And it got me thinking about the long and winding road of my teaching career and whether a comment like that might hold some encouragement for us teachers. I'm especially talking to you teachers in your first couple of years. Like, the first couple of years are hard no matter what. But if you started teaching during the pandemic or even this year, then the difficulty has been multiplied by 1,000. When I started teaching 10 years ago, at least the difficulty was offset by the fact that in our culture, in general, teachers were held in high esteem. And if you want to know whether that's still the case, then I'll tell you what I told my 6-year-old son who asked if he could watch Squid Game because everybody else in first grade was watching it. No. Okay, so I've got 2 reflections to make on that comment that I received, and I hope they're of some encouragement to you to help you keep pressing through now that we're well into the school year. First, that guy's comment convinced me of this: in the process of learning how to teach, it is inevitable that I will disappoint my students. Now, to be clear, I didn't want to disappoint my students. I worked myself into exhaustion those first couple of years and went to all the training and did everything I could to do a good teacher, and I came home every day and fell into a pile of angst and disappointment on the floor. And every teacher I know works that hard to be a good teacher too. But that doesn't change the fact that teaching is a craft, and any craft worth learning requires time. On my wall is a quote from my favorite novel, A River Runs Through It. And the narrator is speaking of his father, who's a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman, and he says this: "My father was very sure about certain matters pertaining to the universe. To him, all good things, trout as well as eternal salvation, come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy." Oh, I have been wrestling to come to terms with that quote for most of my adult life, but I do know this much: good teaching comes by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy. If you're struggling with the art of teaching, remember, it's a craft that requires many years and many struggles to achieve, and in the process of learning that art, we are necessarily going to disappoint our students at times, but that's the only way. So stop beating yourself up. The art does not come easy. And if you're down on yourself thinking that I should be better at this, my response is, no, you shouldn't. You are, in fact, exactly where you should be at this point in your path as a teacher. If you're about to click away because you thought this was supposed to be an encouraging video, then just hold on a second. When I told my wife what I was going to say in this video, she looked at me and she was like, "That is the most depressing thing I've ever heard. Like, you're about to tell teachers who feel like they're drowning, hey, it's okay if you got a bunch of water in your lungs. That's how it's supposed to be." She said, "That's not going to encourage anyone. You're going to need to tell them that even if they're struggling with all of this, what matters is that they're showing up in these kids' lives and that they're making way more of a difference than they will ever know." And you know what? She's right. And I know that because those are the exact same things she said to me when I was in the midst of all those struggles in my first few years. But the truth is, like, I had a hard time believing that. Like, that's the struggle of being there, is that when a lesson falls flat or half the class failed a test that I thought that I prepared them for, all I can focus on is the skills that I lack and the disappointment that I must be engendering in my students. But despite the fact that my former student acknowledged rightly that I had no idea what I was doing in those days, do you know what else he said? He said, "Nevertheless, your class was always my favorite." I mean, I can barely reconcile those two things in my mind, and I will tell you a mystery. Even when I wasn't a skilled teacher, the fact that I showed up every day in those kids' lives somehow meant something. And that relates to the second thing my student made me think about, namely the gap between our ability and our taste and the angst that that gap causes. Now, I get this from the public radio producer Ira Glass, who you may know if you've ever listened to his show, This American Life. I remember hearing an interview with him where he said that every artist, and as I've already established, that includes you if you're a teacher, has high standards for his or her art. For Ira Glass, like, he knew what good radio sounded like, how a good story grabbed you by the shoulders and shook you awake, and he could point to certain shows and reporters and say, that is how it's done. His taste for radio production was way up here, but he discovered something disconcerting when he started producing his own shows and stories. Though he knew what made for good radio and all the elements that went into it, he could not produce radio at the level of his taste. And that's a terrible feeling. Like, I know what's good, but when I try to make it myself, it is never as good as what I like. And that angst, he said, is the place where most people quit their art and find something else. But do you know what Ira Glass did? He kept kept publishing stories and shows over the course of many, many years. And by the time this interview was being conducted, he said, "At this point, I can produce stories at the same level as my taste." But the only way to get there was to endure the angst of the gap between the two. Okay, if you've made it this far in the video, that means you deeply care about being a good teacher, but maybe you feel that angst that Ira Glass was talking about. And if so, let me tell you something. You are a good teacher, and your students are more fortunate than they will ever know to have you, but none of us starts teaching at the level of our taste. And the only way to get there is to show up again tomorrow and keep learning the craft. Remember, art does not come easy, but that doesn't mean it will never come at all. And so my former student was right. I had no idea what I was doing back in those days, but eventually the exhaustion gave way to a new reality at which I was able to teach at the level of my taste. It was a hard road to get there, and I know I disappointed some students along the way, and that's fine. It is what it is. And one day they're going to forgive me because they will find out for themselves in their own careers that art does not come easy. But until then, just keep showing up for them. Your presence in their lives means more than any of us can rightly guess, and that is an encouraging thought.